Welcome to the debate. The focus today is the long and really idiosyncratic career of the American underground rock band, the Feelies, and specifically the paradox, you could say, that sits right at the heart of their enduring cult status.
Right. This is a band from suburban New Jersey, Halden, right? Defined by this very distinct kind of propulsive sound, hypnotic, repetitive, utterly singular in many ways, yet they're probably known just as much for their repeated retreats from the spotlight. They really did spend nearly 50 years operating, like you said, sort of just outside the frame of mainstream recognition.
Exactly. And that's the central conflict, I think, we need to dig into today. The question is, did the Feelies' really radical commitment to, let's call it artistic self-preservation, marked by these multiple long hiatuses, this deep aversion to the mainstream music machine, did that ultimately serve as a successful, sustainable career strategy? One that guaranteed their longevity and, crucially, their artistic integrity? I'm going to argue that yes, it absolutely did.
Okay, and I'll be arguing that this inherent allergy to the very machinery of fame, as it's been put, was actually a profound self-limiting constraint. I think it severely curtailed their rightful commercial and cultural reach, especially during key growth periods of American underground rock, and ultimately condemned their undeniable talent to a level of marginality that just wasn't necessary.
See, I think the Feely story is the ultimate blueprint, really, for successful artistic preservation. Their two big hiatuses were never, in my view, admissions of failure. They were deliberate, necessary withdrawals, essential for maintaining that singular vision they had. And their process proves this right from the start, insisting on self-producing Crazy Rhythms back in 1980, right through their subsequent run on A&M Records. Creative control was always their prime directive. They simply refused to compromise their sound.
I see the desire for control, absolutely. But calling dissolution strategic, I think that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? I mean, their aversion to industry norms, I'd argue, acted as this really inflexible constraint that twice led to genuine breakups. And that denied them the kind of broad reach their talent clearly warranted. Just consider the conflicts they had with both Stiff Records and A&M. These weren't just, noble standoffs for integrity's sake. I think they were avoidable clashes rooted directly in the band's deep allergy to the basic operational necessities of the music business specifically, things like rigorous touring and consistent promotion. I mean, this culminates famously in co-founder Bill Million actively withdrawing to Florida to become a locksmith for 17 years. That feels like strong evidence of a necessary retreat from a world they just couldn't tolerate, not some grand strategic long-term plan.
And look at the massive gap between the critical acclaim for Crazy Rhythms, hailed as a landmark, and its actual commercial reality. That gap demonstrates the failure, I think, of their anti-careerism.
But wait, that locksmith period, that withdrawal, doesn't that highlight the authenticity? I mean, the time between, say, 1981 and 1985, that interregnum period, it wasn't dead time at all. It was incredibly creatively fertile. It allowed the classic five-piece lineup, Mercer, Million, Sauter, Demesky, Weckerman, to really coalesce naturally. They used these low-stakes side projects like the Tripes and Young Woo almost as workshops, developing their material away from the public glare. And their current model, since they reunited around 2008, performing these sporadic, high-profile shows, releasing genuinely vital new albums like Here, Before, and In Between. That's a masterclass in sustainability. It demonstrates that operating on their own self-defined terms actually grants them greater longevity than the typical industry burnout model allows.
Longevity, perhaps, but maybe at the expense of actual presence during crucial times. Let's look a bit closer at those label dynamics you mentioned. You characterize their rejection of industry demands as this triumph of integrity, but I tend to think they actively contributed to the system's failure to support them properly.
Oh, I disagree fundamentally there. The friction with Stiff Records, which singer Glenn Mercer later described, pretty tellingly, I think, as being more interested in self-promotion than in band's development, and even a lot stricter than a major label. That proves the industry system at the time was fundamentally incapable or maybe unwilling to accommodate non-traditional artists. Stiff was notorious for forcing artists into specific molds. And when you have a band like the Feelies meticulously crafting a sound that draws as much from the intricate, phasing minimalism of someone like Steve Reich as it does from the primal churn of the Velvet Underground, well, the standard label machine just isn't equipped to handle that. It doesn't fit the boxes.
Well, hold on. The problem isn't necessarily the presence of esoteric influences. Lots of successful bands have those. The problem, I think, is the refusal or maybe inability to translate that artistry into something more accessible, even just promotionally. That emphasis on minimalist composers, while, yes, creatively fascinating to a critic, is exactly the kind of deep-dive artistic choice that almost ensures you remain a critic's darling, but perhaps never break through to a wider audience. And furthermore, their own behavior seemed to compound the issue. The legend of the 8-hour sound check? It's a great anecdote, sure, but it sounds like it was a genuine obstacle to industry professionalism, apparently frustrating even supportive musicians and surely draining tour budgets. Their deep discomfort with the whole machinery of the music industry, and their clear aversion to the rigors of performance, it meant they never really fully leveraged the critical momentum they definitely earned with albums like Crazy Rhythms. It feels like they actively cultivated their outsider status, turning it into a kind of fortress they rarely ventured out of.
But they were protecting the work, not resisting success itself. And the A&M experience just confirms that this protection was necessary. Okay, they got signed to a major label, right? And then what happens? They're promptly misplaced, kind of forced to play in these half-empty theaters against their better judgment, especially after their supportive A&R staff got lost in some corporate shuffling. That whole episode just confirmed their incompatibility with the major label definition of success. Choosing to opt out or pull back was arguably the only rational way to protect the integrity of that sound they'd worked so meticulously to create.
Okay, if we accept for argument's sake that their label issues stemmed largely from this, let's say, lack of commercial commitment, let's look at how that commitment seemed to waver internally as well. Specifically, that fragmentation that happened almost immediately following their debut album, Crazy Rhythms.
But I have to challenge the idea that the side projects were simply evidence that the band couldn't handle the heat, couldn't cope with the attention.
But isn't that precisely what happened? I mean, at the very moment of their highest profile, when the Village Voice no less anointed them the best underground band in New York, they fragmented. This constant, almost compulsive deconstruction into the Willies, the Tripes, Young Woo, it just dissolved the band's commercial focus right when it mattered most. It fractured the critical and commercial continuity you absolutely need to build a sustained audience beyond the hardcore fans. And look at the fallout. Drummer Stanley Demesky, a core member, eventually left for a period to join Luna, presumably seeking a more consistent performing and recording framework. This constant fracturing, I believe, prevented them from capitalizing on the very indie infrastructure that was growing up around them, partly inspired by them.
See, I would frame that whole transition entirely differently. Those side projects weren't a disillusion. They were the crucible for their greatest, most enduring success later on. That transition, I'd argue, was a strategic deconstruction, maybe not consciously planned in every detail, but strategic in effect. It allowed the classic 5-piece lineup to really develop an organic chemistry, away from the pressure cooker of being the Feelies, the hot new band. That slower, more patient development let them move past the almost hypermanic post-punk energy of the debut and find this more patient, more pastoral evolution in their sound. And the proof is right there. The Good Earth in 1986, co-produced by Peter Buck of REM, someone who clearly understood their vibe. It was the masterpiece born directly from this patient, non-pressured environment. That record simply would not exist, I don't think, had they followed the traditional grinding industry track of album, tour, album, tour. That time away from the direct spotlight was essential for that really significant sonic maturation.
Okay, the record exists, yes, and it's a great record. But its success remained strictly critical, didn't it? By the time they delivered The Good Earth, they had essentially hit the reset button commercially. Any momentum from the debut album was long, long gone. They had to rebuild their audience almost from scratch, which seems like the exact opposite of a successful, continuous career strategy.
But my core thesis remains that the goal was never commercial scale in the first place. It was sustained artistic vitality and control. And this brings us back to that most incredible anecdote, the one that really defines their path, the 17-year hiatus. I mean, just think about that for a moment. 17 years, Bill Million is building locks in Florida, only to return because Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth Appear, someone who deeply understood their integrity and their sound, invited them back to play a show in 2008.
And why did they come back? Sure, because the desire was genuine. I don't doubt that. But maybe also because the market, the niche market for their specific kind of influential, slightly elusive music had finally caught up and started to appreciate that kind of scarcity.
I don't see it as a cynical business model. I see it as almost monastic devotion to integrity. Their current model, these sporadic, high-profile shows often scheduled strategically around holidays when they want to play, that is the definition of a sustainable, decades-long artistic project. It ensures that the music they produce today, like on the album In Between, remains, as critics note, as urgent and inventive today as it did decades ago. And why? Precisely because they never burned out. They never fatigue their audience, or more importantly, themselves.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the eventual outcome entirely justifies the immense sacrifice along the way. Look, their influence is undeniable. They provided a vital blueprint for truly seminal bands like REM, like Yo La Tengo. But their influence, I would argue, is the influence of a blueprint rather than the influence of a widespread cultural force.
What exactly do you mean by that distinction? A blueprint versus a force?
Well, a blueprint means REM could take elements of their sound, maybe streamline some of that nervous energy, add their own thing, and achieve global multi-platinum success. While the Feelies, well, they remained almost a footnote, albeit a revered one, in the liner notes of underground music history. They were like brilliant architectural innovators who never actually got to build the skyscraper themselves. Their long periods of silence meant that the alternative infrastructure they helped inspire, things like college radio, indie record stores, it largely grew up without their consistent presence to help drive or benefit from that movement. And maybe the most concrete example of this failure of reach is the simple fact that their landmark debut album, Crazy Rhythms, remained out of print for years, sometimes decades at a time. That forced their admirers, new and old, to treat it like some rare, hoarded commodity, rather than the accessible foundational text it should have been.
But you could argue that scarcity only fueled the depth and intensity of their cult status. The very fact that the music remains so revered across generations, often discovered through word of mouth or finding those rare copies, without requiring massive, constant industry promotion. Doesn't that actually validate their path? For me, the story of the Feelies proves that radical consistency to one's own vision, defining one's own terms, even if that path involves 2 breakups and a long locksmith career, is ultimately the definition of a long-term success story in the notoriously unforgiving music industry. They stand as an undeniable model for artistic integrity, securing a discography that critics pretty uniformly hail as timeless.
Okay, their integrity is absolutely unquestionable. Nobody's debating that. And their records are vital, unique works of art. But their radical anti-careerism, as I see it, remains a double-edged sword. While they achieved this nearly flawless, highly influential discography, their story also starkly shows the heavy price often paid for refusing to fully engage with the momentum they themselves helped create. And that price, I think, is measured in lost reach, missed opportunities, and a diminished presence within the very musical movement they were so instrumental in defining.
And that tension, that push and pull, that's perhaps the core of their ongoing appeal, isn't it? The career path of the Feelies just perfectly illuminates that perennial struggle, that constant negotiation between commercial reach and artistic control.
Leaving us and perhaps listeners to contemplate whether enduring quality, true lasting impact, is always best achieved by operating, as the Feelies did for so long, essentially hiding in plain sight.